whitish mist spreads over the dark waters of the Black Sea, obscuring the outlines of the coastline, jagged with bays and rocks. If one peers into this haze through the prism of time, transporting oneself to late June, early July of 1942, instead of silence, we would hear a continuous, maddening roar. This is not the sound of the surf. This is the sound of metal and stone being ground, of an entire world collapsing, compressed to the size of a small patch of land on Cape Chersonesus. Here, on a narrow strip of land, with their backs to the sea, tens of thousands of people gaze at the horizon with hope that melts with each hour, each minute. They are waiting for ships, waiting for salvation, which was promised, but which for the absolute majority of them will never come. The air hangs heavy with a pungent mixture of smoke, limestone dust, and the smell of hot iron. The sun, at its zenith, mercilessly burns all living things, but the heat is the least of the evils. The sky overhead has ceased to be the sky. It has turned into a conveyor belt for delivering destruction. Airplanes with black crosses on their wings make repeated passes, methodically dropping their cargo on people who have nowhere left to hide. This is the finale of a drama that lasted 250 days. These are the last hours of the defense of Sevastopol, an event that will go down in history as an example of the highest human spirit and, at the same time, as one of the most difficult and controversial pages of military chronicles, where heroism coexists with the tragedy of abandonment. To understand how this army, which until recently seemed invincible, ended up trapped on the cliffs of Chersonesus, one must rewind time and look at the map. The Crimean Peninsula has always been the key to controlling the entire Black Sea basin. And Sevastopol was the tip of that key. A city born to be a warrior, a city battery, a city fortress. For the Soviet command, the loss of Crimea meant the loss of control over sea communications and a direct threat to Caucasian oil. For the German command, Crimea was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Red Army, threatening Romanian oil fields, without which the entire mechanized machine of the Wehrmacht would have stalled within a couple of months. The stakes were extremely high. In the autumn of 1941, the 11th German Army, under the command of Erich von Manstein, broke through the defenses at Perekop and flooded into the steppe Crimea like an avalanche. Soviet units retreated, unable to gain a foothold on the flat, table-like surface of the steppe. It seemed the peninsula was lost. But this swift river of the German offensive had one obstacle: Sevastopol. The city was not prepared for defense from land. All its might, all its gigantic guns faced the sea, awaiting enemy squadrons. Engineers and ordinary citizens had to accomplish the impossible. In the shortest possible time, to turn the fortification system 180 degrees. Thousands of women, old men, and teenagers went out with picks and shovels to dig into the rocky ground, creating defensive belts where gardens and vineyards had bloomed just yesterday. When Manstein's advanced units approached the city in November of '41, they expected to take it on the fly. This was the tactic of lightning strikes, which had worked flawlessly in Europe and in the first months on the Eastern Front. But here, at the foot of the Fedyukin Heights and the Mackenziev Mountains, an irresistible force met an immovable object. Literally, Sevastopol met the enemy with fire from its coastal batteries. The legendary 30th and 35th coastal batteries played a special role in this. These were not just artillery positions, but real underground cities hidden under many meters of concrete and rock. Their 305mm caliber guns could send shells weighing almost half a ton for tens of kilometers. The first assault choked. German infantry, encountering fierce resistance from the Marines, those very black greatcoats, whom they called Black Death, were forced to stop. The sailors, having disembarked from ships onto land, fought with a special, desperate audacity. For them, there was no concept of tactical retreat. Behind them was their home, their ships, their sea. This first success of the defense created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that the city was impregnable, that it could be held forever, turning it into a Soviet Tobruk or Verdun. However, Manstein was not an enemy who repeated mistakes. Realizing that the fortress could not be taken by a cavalry charge, he began methodical preparations for the second assault, scheduled for December 1941. The Germans brought up reserves, artillery, and aviation. A battle of attrition began. In those winter days, under the biting, icy wind, the fate of the city hung by a thread. German units broke into the defenses, approaching the North Bay within cannon shot. The situation was saved by a daring amphibious operation in Kerch and Feodosia. Soviet command landed troops in Manstein's rear, forcing him to withdraw some forces from Sevastopol and transfer them to the east of the peninsula. The city got a respite. This respite, which lasted until the beginning of summer 1942, became a time of incredible tension and surreal daily life. Sevastopol went underground. Full-fledged life was organized in the adits of Inkerman, in deep cellars and casemates. Factories worked there, repairing weapons and producing mines. Hospitals, schools, and even cinemas operated there. People lived without sunlight for weeks, breathing stale air permeated with the smell of machine oil and medicine. Sewing workshops in the dungeons made uniforms. Children learned to write and read under the roar of bombings above. This was a unique social organism, united by common misfortune and a common goal. In this underground world, the lines between civilian and military blurred. A woman standing at a machine was as much a fighter as a soldier in a trench. The garrison's supply depended on the thin thread of sea transport. Transport ships, destroyers, and cruisers of the Black Sea Fleet broke through to the besieged city through minefields and under continuous attacks from German aviation. These voyages were called _0_. Every arrival of a ship was a holiday. Every unloading was hampered by dive bomber raids. Back, the ships carried away the wounded and civilians, but evacuation never kept pace with the number of those wishing to leave the fiery cauldron. It was during this period that a special Sevastopol character was formed, a calm fatalism mixed with a determination to do one's duty to the end. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, processes of an entirely different kind were taking place. The German command, irritated by the protracted siege, decided to put an end to the Thorn in Crimea once and for all. An operation codenamed Sturfang, sturgeon catch, was developed. For its implementation, an unprecedented concentration of artillery was amassed near Sevastopol. The density of guns per kilometer of front reached unheard-of values. Monsters of siege equipment were brought here, 600mm Karl mortars and the gigantic 800mm Dora railway gun. The Dora shell weighed 7 tons and could penetrate rocky ground to a depth of 30 meters. The goal of this iron fist was not just the destruction of fortifications, but the psychological suppression of the defenders. The Germans wanted to show that resistance was meaningless in the face of such technocratic power. Preparations for the third, decisive assault were carried out with German meticulousness. Every meter of Soviet defense was photographed from the air. Every pillbox was mapped. Manstein knew he had no right to make a mistake. Time was working against Germany, which needed troops on other fronts. In early June 1942, hell broke loose. The artillery preparation lasted 5 days. 5 days of continuous thunder, when the earth shook as if in an earthquake and rocks turned into rubble. Witnesses recalled that blood flowed from their ears due to pressure changes, and dust choked their lungs so much that it was impossible to breathe. It seemed that after such a fiery barrage, no one alive should remain in the positions. But when the German infantry went on the attack, the ruins came alive. Soviet soldiers emerged from under the rubble, dusted off their machine guns, and opened fire. A battle of attrition began, where one side's resources were practically limitless, while the others dwindled with each passing hour. The main problem for the defenders was a shortage of ammunition. Shells for anti-aircraft and field artillery had to be conserved. The Luftwaffe's aerial dominance became absolute. German dive bombers hung over the city from dawn till dusk, paralyzing all movement and destroying approaching ships even before they reached the bay. The sea supply route was effectively cut off. Now cargo could only be delivered by fast ships under cover of night or by submarines whose capacity was minuscule compared to the needs of the enormous garrison. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the Soviet command, particularly Admiral Oktyabrski, commander of the fleet, and General Petrov, faced a monstrous dilemma. On one hand, there was an order from the Stavka to hold Sevastopol at all costs. On the other, it became evident that further defense under conditions of complete blockade and lack of ammunition would lead to the army's complete annihilation. Internal conflict tore at the leadership. Officers saw their regiments melt away, their batteries fall silent one after another due to lack of shells. By mid-June, the Germans broke through to the northern bay. This became a turning point. The northern side of the city was lost. The remaining defenders crossed to the southern side, but now the entire water area of the bay was swept by enemy artillery with direct fire. The arrival of large surface ships became impossible. The last major vessel to break into the city was the destroyer leader Tashkent. Its voyage became a legend, overcrowded with wounded, its hull riddled with holes. It managed to escape to Novorossiysk, performing a miracle of survival. But this was an exception. The city was left alone against the enemy. In these critical days, the full depth of the ideological confrontation became apparent. On the German side, a cold, calculating machine of destruction operated, confident in its superiority. On the Soviet side, there was a mixture of despair, fury, and self-sacrifice. People understood that they were doomed, but continued to fight. Why? This cannot be explained by propaganda alone or fear of barrier troops. A different mechanism was at work here, a sense of camaraderie, the impossibility of betraying a comrade lying next to them in the trench, and a deep, visceral hatred for the invaders who had turned a flourishing city into ruins. The defense shrank like shagreen leather. First, the outer perimeters fell, then the fighting moved to the city streets. Ruined Sevastopol became a trap. On June 30th, it became clear. The climax had arrived. Ammunition for heavy artillery ran out completely. The famous 30th Battery, having fired all its ammunition, fired blank charges, simply to drive off infantry with a jet of powder gases, until the Germans blew up the gun turrets. The 35th Battery remained the last bastion of organized resistance on Cape Chersonis. It is here, in the last days of June, that an event takes place which still provokes fierce disputes among historians and moralists. Admiral Oktyabrski sends a telegram to Moscow reporting the impossibility of further defense and requesting permission to evacuate the command staff. Stalin gives his approval. This decision becomes a bifurcation point dividing the defenders into two categories: those who were to be saved and those who were left to cover the retreat. The evacuation plan was, to put it mildly, selective. Priority was given to the highest command staff, party functionaries, and specialists. Planes and submarines were sent for them. Ordinary soldiers, junior officers, the wounded, and medical personnel remained on shore. The official version stated that the evacuation of the entire army was technically impossible. And there was a grain of bitter truth in this. The fleet had suffered heavy losses and could not ensure the evacuation of 100,000 people under enemy air superiority. But the way in which the elite's evacuation was organized, and the secrecy with which it was surrounded from the main body of troops, created an atmosphere of betrayal. The scene at the Chersones airfield on the night of July 1st, 1942, resembled frames from an apocalyptic film. The roar of the _0_ transport aircraft engines was drowned out by the explosions of mines. People, realizing that there wouldn't be enough room for everyone, tried to storm the planes. NKVD officers fired into the air, and sometimes to kill, to restrain the crowd and ensure the command's departure. General Petrov, according to eyewitnesses, flew away in a severe psychological state, effectively being forced to obey orders. But the fact remains, the commanders flew away and the army stayed behind. After the command's departure, the organized defense broke down into pockets. On Cape Chersones and in the area of the 35th Battery, according to various estimates, 60,000 to 80,000 people accumulated. These were remnants of different divisions, Marines, the wounded, and city residents. They had practically no water. The Crimean summer is hot, and sources were captured or under fire. They had no food or ammunition. They were pressed against the sea, awaiting the promised ships. Desperate radio messages flew through the air, openly pleading for help. "Send ships, we are dying!" Some small vessels, patrol boats, minesweepers, even submarines, tried to approach the shore to pick up people. But these were drops in the ocean. Each boarding turned into a tragedy. People threw themselves into the water, trying to swim to the boats, drowned under the weight of soaked uniforms, clung to the sides. Those who didn't find a place remained on shore, watching the silhouettes disappear into the darkness. The final days of the defense of Chersonesus were a chronicle of agony. The Germans methodically tightened the ring, shelling concentrations of people with artillery and flattening them with aviation. Many defenders, unwilling to surrender, took refuge in the casemates of the 35th Battery. When the Germans blocked the exits, dramas unfolded inside, the full details of which we will never know. It is known that the last defenders of the battery, having exhausted all possibilities for resistance, blew up the main structures along with themselves. By July 4th, 1942, it was all over. The silence that descended on Cape Chersonesus was more terrifying than the roar of cannon fire. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers and sailors were taken prisoner. Columns of prisoners stretched for many kilometers. Their path led to camps, from which many were not destined to return. The bodies of the fallen littered the coast in several layers, and the sea continued to wash up sailor caps and gymnasticas for a long time. Analyzing this tragedy decades later, we inevitably face the question, was there meaning in this sacrifice? Cynical military calculation says, yes. The defense of Sevastopol tied down Manstein's 11th Army for almost 9 months. These divisions did not go to Stalingrad when it was critically important for the Germans. The time gained by the blood of Sevastopol's defenders allowed Soviet industry to evacuate and establish the production of tanks and aircraft. Perhaps these very months were what Hitler lacked for victory on the southern flank. Sevastopol ground down the enemy's best forces, bleeding the elite of the Wehrmacht. However, the human dimension of this story does not fit into the dry lines of strategic analysis. The people abandoned on the shore are not just, quote, zero. This is an unhealing wound in the national memory. This is a question of the authorities' responsibility to those they send to defend their interests. The contrast between the heroism of ordinary soldiers fighting with stones and bayonets when ammunition ran out, and the pragmatic, if not cynical, decision to evacuate the top brass creates a complex moral dilemma. Can the salvation of a general be justified by the loss of a division? In the logic of total war, probably yes, since a general is a bearer of experience and command. In the logic of humanity, it is betrayal. This paradox has no unambiguous solution. It hangs in the air, like that very fog over the sea. The history of Sevastopol's defense teaches us that war is not about parade marches and beautiful maps with arrows. It is dirt, thirst, fear, and the gravest moral choices that must be made every second. The lesson of Sevastopol is the lesson of the price of victory. We are accustomed to being proud of the result, but often forget about the cost paid for this result by specific people whose names have dissolved into the lists of missing in action. Today, if you come to the 35th Battery, transformed into a memorial, you will see the pantheon of memory. On its walls are thousands of names, and when you look at the sea from that very cliff where the last defenders stood in July of '42, you feel a strange connection of times. The waves still crash against the rocks, the gulls still cry out, but in this noise, it's not just nature that you hear now. You hear the echo of those days, the voices of those who did not leave, those who remained here forever, becoming part of this land, this stone, this history. The fortress fell, but the spirit of its defenders was not broken. They did not surrender. They went into eternity, leaving us the right to live and the duty to remember. To remember not only triumph, but also bitterness. To understand the true weight of the scales of history. And perhaps it is in this memory that the highest justice lies, which we can render to them.